Every human being has a finite reservoir of cognitive energy. What we call attention isn't just some abstract idea. It's a real, biologically constrained neural mechanism governed by networks in the brain like the prefrontal cortex and the parietal lobe. Your attention is a limited resource, and it's being fought over every single day. Notifications, gossip, social comparison, digital media. These aren't neutral inputs. They're engineered to hijack your focus by manipulating your brain's dopamine system, pulling you into cycles of distraction and depletion. This is not just bad for productivity. It actively reshapes your neural architecture, training your brain to be reactive rather than intentional. The human prefrontal cortex is the conductor of focus. It determines what information gets priority and what gets filtered out. But it doesn't operate in isolation. It's influenced by your emotional state, stress levels, sleep quality, and even blood glucose. That means every late night doom scrolling session or endless comparison on social media isn't just wasting time. It's degrading the neurobiological foundation of your ability to concentrate. And the more you let external forces direct your attention, the less control you retain over your inner world. The average person shifts focus hundreds of times a day, many without realizing it. And each of these transitions carries a cognitive cost. You lose momentum, you lose depth. You train your brain to expect novelty and distraction rather than depth and discipline. What's essential to understand is this: if you don't choose where your attention goes, someone else will. Focus isn't just about getting things done. It's about deciding who you become, because what you repeatedly focus on wires your brain to value those things. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, is always active. Your habits, your identity, your emotional baseline, these are being molded every time you choose to check your phone instead of staying present in your work. Every time you scroll past other people's lives instead of reflecting on your own. Focus, therefore, is a moral choice. It's a physiological vote for the life you want to live. Now, here's the science-backed truth that most people don't want to hear. Your brain wasn't designed for multitasking. When you task it, say, from studying to checking a message to glancing at your feed, you're not doing two things at once. You're rapidly toggling between neural networks. This switch activates the salience network in the brain, and with each toggle, your brain experiences a delay. This cognitive switching comes with a cost, an actual metabolic toll, measurable in decreased glucose and oxygen delivery to critical regions of the brain responsible for executive function. That means the more you switch, the more depleted you become, the less capable you are of sustained deep work or even basic emotional regulation. This is why reclaiming your attention must become a non-negotiable priority. It starts with awareness, recognizing that attention is being pulled by forces that don't have your long-term interest in mind. You have to create rituals and systems to protect it. That means defining time blocks where your phone is in another room. That means structuring your day around cognitive peaks and valleys, when you're most alert versus when you're fatigued. That means learning to train your visual focus through techniques like gaze anchoring, where you deliberately fix your gaze on a single point to narrow your attentional spotlight. These practices aren't hacks, they're rewiring protocols. They teach your brain to focus deeper, longer, and with more control. The reason most people never change is not because they lack intelligence or willpower. It's because they allow their focus to be diluted by things that don't move the needle of their life. And over time, this habitual dilution becomes a baseline. They normalize low-grade distraction. They normalize being pulled in 10 different directions. But those who learn to reclaim their attention begin to notice something extraordinary. Their capacity expands. They become more intentional, more creative, more resilient. Because when you focus on the right thing consistently, deliberately, you not only direct your energy, you shape your brain. And that's the real power behind focusing on yourself. The human brain is driven by a reward system that determines how and where we apply effort. At the core of this system is dopamine, a neurochemical often misunderstood as merely the pleasure molecule. In reality, dopamine is the molecule of motivation, pursuit, and desire. It is the signal that tells the brain, this is worth doing again. The way the system is trained determines whether we stay focused and self-driven or scattered and externally dependent. Internal validation is the process of learning to generate that dopamine from within. By aligning reward with personal effort, growth, and self-directed values. This is not just motivational fluff. It's fundamental neurobiology. The problem arises when your dopamine system becomes wired to external feedback, social media, approval from others, likes, comments, even compliments. They all have one thing in common. They train your brain to expect reward from sources outside your control. Over time, this weakens intrinsic drive. You begin to wait for affirmation before acting. You begin to fear rejection more than stagnation. Your system becomes dependent, like a muscle that hasn't been used. The neural pathways responsible for autonomous motivation atrophy. But when you shift the source of reward inward, when you begin to feel satisfaction not from applause but from effort, you begin to change the structure and sensitivity of your own motivational circuitry. This process starts in the mesolimbic dopamine system, particularly the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and the nucleus accumbens. These areas are responsible for evaluating effort and determining whether it's worth it to pursue something. When you reward yourself mentally for showing up, for executing even small steps, you reinforce those effort-based dopamine loops. That's critical because the more often you do that, the more your brain begins to associate effort, not outcome, with reward. That means you're no longer waiting for success to feel good. You feel good for showing up, pushing through resistance, and doing the hard thing. This builds what psychologists call grit and what neuroscientists call effort-based neuroplasticity. One of the most powerful things you can do to train this internal system is to practice deliberate reflection. This doesn't mean you journal endlessly about your feelings. It means you take just 60 seconds at the end of a work session, a workout, or a challenging conversation and ask yourself, what did I do that aligned with my values? What resistance did I push through? Where did I grow, even slightly? This tiny habit triggers the brain's reward circuitry in a way that reinforces self-respect, not self-judgment. The brain responds by tagging that activity as meaningful and worth repeating. Another key component is verbal framing, the language you use internally when assessing yourself. If your self-talk is centered around external comparison, I'm not as good as them, I didn't get enough likes, they didn't notice, your reward system will default to external validation. But if your inner dialogue shifts to statements like, I kept going when it was uncomfortable, or I followed through even when it wasn't perfect, you're assigning reward to behavior, not approval. This is a subtle but biologically significant change. It rewires how dopamine is distributed during and after action, and that changes your capacity for sustained long-term effort. There's also a physiological layer here. Your autonomic nervous system is constantly interpreting whether an action is safe or threatening, validating or diminishing. When you constantly chase validation, you put yourself in a sympathetic, dominant state, alert, anxious, performance-oriented. This is not inherently bad, but if it's the default mode, it becomes draining. In contrast, internally validated effort allows your nervous system to settle into a more regulated state. You're alert but not stressed, engaged but not desperate. This creates conditions for what's known as parasympathetic recovery, which is essential for brain-body integration, habit formation, and emotional resilience. Internal validation is not about being indifferent to others. It's about building a system that runs whether people clap for you or not. It's about training your brain to derive reward from showing up for your values, not waiting to be seen by the crowd. This internal reward system is your ultimate leverage because once it's activated, it can power you through rejection, resistance, boredom, and fear. It's not dependent on conditions. It's dependent on practice. The more consistently you assign value to the process, not the praise, the more you reinforce the neural patterns of independence, mastery, and confidence. This is how you stop being a reactor and become a creator of your own momentum. And all of it is neurobiologically trainable through daily repetition, intentional reflection, and effort-focused reinforcement. Your mind and body are not separate systems. They are deeply intertwined, operating in a dynamic feedback loop that governs how you think, feel, and act. Most people assume their thoughts influence how they move or behave, and that's true, but it's just half the story. Your physical state has a direct and often dominant effect on your mental state. This means if you want to change how you think, how motivated you feel, how focused or emotionally stable you are, you must begin by altering your physiological inputs. This is a principle rooted in hard neuroscience, not wishful thinking. Inside your body exists a network called the autonomic nervous system, divided into two main branches: the sympathetic nervous system, which mobilizes energy for action, commonly known as the fight or flight system, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which supports rest, digestion, and recovery. These two systems are always in balance, constantly modulating based on your breathing patterns, posture, light exposure, movement, and internal chemistry. The moment your physical state shifts through posture, breath, or movement, your brain receives signals that determine whether you should be alert, calm, reactive, focused, or fatigued. Consider this. Your brain doesn't know the external world directly. It only interprets signals from your body and your senses. If you're slouched over, staring at a screen in dim light, barely breathing, your brain interprets that as a signal of low engagement or even defeat. In contrast, when you stand upright, move with intent, expose yourself to natural light, and regulate your breathing, your brain receives a completely different signal, one of readiness, alertness, and competent. These signals then influence which neurochemicals are released: norepinephrine for alertness, dopamine for motivation, serotonin for mood regulation, and so on. One of the most immediate tools to shift your mental state is breath work. The rate and depth of your breathing modulate your heart rate and vagal tone, which in turn impact your emotional state and cognitive clarity. Fast, shallow breathing tells the brain that something is wrong, increasing cortisol and stress reactivity. Slow, controlled breathing with extended exhales stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, down-regulating anxiety and improving executive function. This is not a theory, it's observable in real time through heart rate variability, EEG patterns, and stress hormone levels. Learning to control your breath gives you access to your mental state on command. Movement is another major input. Physical activity, whether it's strength training, walking, sprinting, or yoga, activates the motor cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum, which are not only responsible for movement, but also deeply involved in learning, attention, and emotional regulation. Movement increases circulation to the brain, delivering oxygen and nutrients while flushing out metabolic waste. It also increases levels of brain-digested neurotrophic factor, BDNF, a protein that supports neural growth, plasticity, and cognitive resilience. When you feel mentally stuck, the fastest route out isn't thinking harder, it's moving your body. Environmental inputs matter too. Light, especially natural sunlight, plays a critical role in regulating your circadian rhythm, which influences everything from sleep to mood to hormone balance. Morning sunlight exposure within the first 30-60 minutes of waking triggers a cascade of biological effects. It suppresses melatonin, increases cortisol at the right time, and sets your internal clock to stay aligned with the 24-hour day. People who skip this step, staying indoors, avoiding light, disrupt this rhythm, and experience sluggishness, irritability, and cognitive fog. Resetting your physiology begins with resetting your exposure to the natural world, especially light and temperature. Another key factor is visual attention. Where you direct your gaze determines your level of arousal and focus. When your eyes are darting around constantly, checking notifications, switching tabs, scrolling feeds, your brain enters a state of fragmented, reactive attention. But when you engage gaze anchoring, deliberately focusing your eyes on a single point, you reduce neural noise and improve the signal to noise ratio in the brain. This practice quiets overactivity in the default mode network and increases activation in the frontal attentional systems responsible for deep focus and intentionality. Vision isn't just a sense, it's a steering mechanism for your state of mind. Temperature modulation is also a tool for state control. Brief exposure to cold, such as cold showers or ice baths, activates the locus ceruleus, a brainstem region that releases norepinephrine and drives alertness. It also builds stress tolerance by teaching your nervous system how to remain calm under discomfort. These physiological interventions don't require motivation, they create it. They flip a switch in your brain, shifting you from passivity into purposeful engagement. If you want to master your mind, you have to first master your body's inputs. You cannot outthink poor sleep, inactivity, shallow breathing, or environmental misalignment. Your physical state is not separate from your mental one. It is the foundation on which it rests. The more consistently you harness your physiology as a lever, the more predictable and reliable your mental performance becomes. Your environment is not neutral. It is a set of inputs, visual, auditory, tactile, and psychological, that shape the output of your behavior, your attention, and ultimately your identity. The human brain is highly plastic, constantly reorganizing its circuitry based on repeated experience and sensory exposure. When you surround yourself with clutter, notifications, noise, or visual chaos, you are training your nervous system to operate in a state of hypervigilance and fragmentation. In contrast, when you deliberately design your surroundings to support focus, clarity, and simplicity, you engage a different set of neural circuits that promote deep work, calm, and behavioral consistency. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for goal-directed behavior, planning, and attention, is highly sensitive to environmental cues. It acts like a filter, constantly determining what deserves your focus and what should be ignored. But this filter can be overwhelmed. When you are surrounded by competing stimuli, your phone lighting up, background noise, open tabs, irrelevant objects on your desk, the prefrontal cortex must work overtime to suppress those distractions. This creates what's known as attentional load, and it leads to cognitive fatigue, reduced working memory, and decision-making errors. Over time, this chronic overload conditions your brain to expect shallow engagement, not sustained concentration. To shift this pattern, the first principle is to simplify the visual field. The visual system has a direct line to the brain's attentional networks. A cluttered desk, a chaotic room, or a distracting digital interface activates the brain's orienting reflex, the mechanism that pulls attention toward new or salient stimuli. By reducing visual noise, you lower the frequency of that reflex, allowing the brain to maintain focus on a single task or object. This is not just aesthetic, it's neurological. Minimal environments are not about style, they're about decreasing activation in the dorsal attention network so that the brain can maintain its cognitive grip on what matters most. Next is auditory control. The human brain evolved to detect and respond to sound as a survival mechanism. Even low-level background noise can spike cortisol and increase micro-arousals in the nervous system. This means working in environments with constant chatter, traffic noise, or even overly stimulating music can derail your capacity to stay in flow. Creating a low-noise environment or using non-distracting soundscapes like white noise, pink noise, or frequency-based focus tracks can stabilize your internal rhythm. This influences brainwave patterns, nudging them into states more conducive to learning, focus, and calm. Equally important is digital architecture. Your devices, platforms, and screens are extensions of your environment. Most digital tools are designed not for your focus, but for your addiction. Every notification, badge, buzz, and red icon is a mini dopamine cue, an invitation to interrupt your attention and shift your behavioral trajectory. One of the most powerful environmental interventions is to remove or restrict access to digital stimuli that are not essential to your core work. This includes muting notifications, using grayscale modes, clearing your home screen, or scheduling specific times to check email or social media. These boundaries are not about discipline alone. They are about protecting your neurochemistry from manipulation. Lighting is another key environmental variable. Light doesn't just help you see, it regulates your circadian rhythm, affects melatonin release, and influences alertness through specialized cells in the eye, known as intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, PRGCs. Bright, natural light in the morning increases cortisol at the correct time of day, enhancing your ability to focus and feel energized. In contrast, dim or artificial light environments during the day can dysregulate your biological clock, leading to mental fog and poor sleep quality. Environmental design, then, must account for light as a timing and arousal signal that instructs your brain on how to function. The placement of tools and cues within your workspace also matters. This principle is rooted in cue-based behavior design. The objects in your immediate field of vision should signal action, not distraction. A water bottle signals hydration. A notebook signals reflection. A single open book signals study. Your brain responds to these as environmental triggers, engaging different circuits based on what is visible and accessible. If your environment is filled with triggers for consumption, open tabs, food, phone, television, then those behaviors will will dominate. If it's designed around triggers for action, checklists, project boards, fitness gear, then action becomes the default pathway. Temperature and scent are often overlooked, but they also play significant roles in shaping internal state through external design. A slightly cool environment promotes alertness by activating thermoregulatory systems in the hypothalamus. Scent through the olfactory bulb connects directly to the limbic system, the part of the brain responsible for emotion and memory. Certain scents like peppermint or rosemary have been shown to enhance alertness and memory retrieval. These may seem like small changes, but they produce measurable shifts in state and behavior, especially when compounded over time. Environmental design is not just about making your space look better. It's about signaling to your brain what mode it should be in. Every aspect of your surroundings, light, noise, visuals, layout, digital presence, is sending signals to your nervous system, shaping your patterns of attention, your energy levels, and your behavioral momentum. The more deliberately you shape these signals, the more influence you gain over your internal state and the quality of your actions.